Lion begs gorilla for help. What happened next left scientists speechless. On fell slowly, like the first breath of the forest. Refunds. Shafts of light slipped through the dense canopy, painting the earth below in soft gold. A carpet laid out for the quiet awakening of the wild. Deep within a conservation outpost along the African forest's edge, where howler monkeys replaced alarm clocks, Dr. Elias set his coffee mug on the windowsill, eyes heavy with fatigue, not yet ready for another cold season morning. The sanctuary felt unusually still. Only the thudding boots of a ranger running down the corridor broke the silence. "We've got a lion badly injured." The young guard panted, shirt streaked with mud. "He's caught in a poacher's trap. He's bleeding a lot. I don't think he'll make it till noon." Elias sprang to his feet, grabbed his emergency kit, and minutes later was crouched in the rescue pen. There, lying in a pool of blood, still steaming in the morning chill, was a full-grown male lion, powerful, broken, eyes glazed, breath shallow. The steel trap still clamped onto his front leg. Elias signaled everyone to step back and knelt beside the animal. His hands trembled when he noticed a faint scar behind the lion's left ear, a curved mark, identical to the one he'd memorized from years ago. That scar haunted him, years back, in a massive wildfire. Elias had rescued a lion cub. The young creature had survived by a miracle and lived at the sanctuary for 4 months before being released. During those months, something unusual happened to a juvenile primate named Kazzy. Even then, a quiet but observant alpha would sit outside the cub's enclosure, tapping the dirt twice in what seemed like an invitation to play. That odd little rhythm, that memory, it never left Elias. And now, here it was again. Elias wasn't the kind of man to believe in miracles. But when the lion tried to raise his head after hearing Kazzy tap the floor twice, exactly the same way his heart dared to hope, the team moved the lion into intensive care. Elias began treatment immediately. Antibiotics, fluids. But nothing worked. The wound festered, the fever climbed, and the lion stopped eating. Elias stayed up 3 nights in a row. By the 4th, he nearly gave up. But that night, something unexplainable happened. Kazzy, who had never left his enclosure in 12 years, somehow unlocked his gate and made his way silently to the lion's cage. No one saw how. But Elias found Kazzy sitting quietly beside the enclosure, tapping twice on the floor, staring with eyes wide open. And right then, the lion's erratic heartbeat started to stabilize. He blinked and let out a low growl, not of pain but recognition. The next morning, he ate his first piece of meat. Elias stood in silent awe. Kazzy didn't say a word, he never could, but something passed between them. Something real. Elias gave the lion a name, Rengo. In Swahili, it means the one who returns. From that day forward, Kazzy and Rengo shared something deeper than instinct. They would sit for hours beside each other, without moving, without noise, without force. Kazzy once tapped his chest gently and then drummed the ground twice. Rengo, in response, leaned in and licked Kazzy's hand. A month passed. One stormy night, the security cameras triggered. Elias ran out to check. A sharp bang split the rain. Pain shot through his shoulder shrapnel. He fell to the mud. In that instant, Kazzy leapt through the rain and shielded Elias with his own body. A flash, a cry of pain. Kazzy was hit in the back. But it wasn't over. From behind the metal gates, a roar thundered across the compound. Rengo, still recovering, had broken free. He charged the intruder, stood over Kazzy like a blazing wall of muscle, and bared his teeth. The poacher tried to flee, but Rengo knocked him down, pinning him until rangers arrived. A gun and a remote detonator fell from the attacker's coat. He was part of a poaching ring trying to destroy the sanctuary's evidence records, exposing an illegal wildlife trade operation. The story spread like wildfire. A lion returns to defend his old friend. A primate takes a wound to shield a man. The world watched. Media, film crews, sponsors, everyone wanted a piece of the miracle. But Elias turned them all away. "Humans always want to strap cameras onto miracles," he said. "But not everything beautiful needs to be lit up. Some things are meant to be trusted, not televised." Then came the hardest day. The conservation board ordered Rengo's release back into the wild. Elias fought it, but Kazzy understood. On a windy afternoon, Kazzy walked up to Rengo, unlatched the GPS collar, and stepped back. Rengo didn't roar, didn't run. He simply tapped the ground twice and disappeared into the forest. He didn't look back. Elias was silent. So was Kazzy. For 3 days, Kazzy refused to eat. Then, just before dawn one morning, a ranger reported hearing something strange from deep in the woods, two distinct sounds, a slow, double knock, and a soft, distant roar. No one saw Kazzy leave. No one saw Rengo return, but everyone knew they were still out there. A month later, Elias received a letter from a journalist who had followed the story closely. I went through the archives. It read, "The scar matches, the timing matches. I'm certain Rengo was the cub you saved years ago." The envelope also contained a grainy infrared photo. Kazzy stood at the forest's edge, one hand pressed to the earth, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond, and in the shadow, two golden eyes, watching back. The forest had its own memory, long after footsteps vanished and voices were swallowed by green. It remembered. It remembered blood in the soil and laughter in the canopy. It remembered a lion's paw print pressed too hard into mud, and the soft echo of two taps beneath the fig tree at dusk. Days had passed since Rengo left, but in the sanctuary, silence remained heavy. Kazzy hadn't touched his food. He no longer made his usual morning circle around the enclosure or climbed to the perch near Elias's window. Instead, he sat quietly in the same corner each sunrise, facing east, where the first slivers of light slipped through. Elias watched him from afar, unsure what to say. He knew grief wasn't just a human luxury, and Kazzy was grieving not in howls or rage, but in stillness, in the way his fingers absent-mindedly tapped the ground, as if waiting for an answer. The sanctuary had changed since the poacher incident. Security was tighter, rangers rotated on night shifts, reporters still called, hoping for interviews. But Elias refused them all. "There's no story here," he told them, "just a vow being kept." Yet even as he spoke those words, something stirred uneasily inside him. 2 days ago, a trail camera deep in the forest had sent back an image blurred, but unmistakable. Rengo, not alone. Behind him, another lion, larger, younger, no collar, and far more alert. The team speculated it might be a new pride, a reshuffling of territories. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, the sky cracked open. Rain fell like it hadn't in weeks, pounding against the tin roofs of the sanctuary like war drums. Elias lit a lantern, his shoulder still sore from the shrapnel wound. At 2:17 a.m., the camera alarms triggered again. Zone 7, the outer boundary. When Elias reached the monitors, what he saw sent a chill through his spine. Kazzy was no longer in his enclosure, but his tracker showed he was inside the sanctuary's perimeter, near the eastern ridge, and moving fast. Elias grabbed his coat, a flashlight, and ran, through puddles and fallen branches. His boots sank into the earth. The wind howled through the trees like a warning, and then he saw it, a shape darting between shadows. Low to the ground, muscular, fast. "Rengo are you?" Not alone. Elias raised his light just in time to catch the flash of golden-furred two lions, and Kazzy, standing between them. For a breathless second, all three stood still. Kazzy, arms slightly spread. The larger lion, growling low. Rengo, flank to flank, shielding Kazzy. Elias called out, voice hoarse. Kazzy, the moment shattered. The younger lion lunged forward, but not toward Elias, toward Rengo. They clashed with a snarl, a fury of claws and teeth. Rengo held his ground, but it was clear he was defending, not attacking. And Kazzy didn't move, just stood there trembling, hands pressed to his chest like a child caught in a storm he didn't understand. Elias shouted again, louder. That broke the spell. The younger lion turned, ears flicking toward the human voice. Hesitation. Rengo used that second to push forward, knocking the lion back, away from Kazzy. The two predators stared at each other. Elias didn't wait. He ran to Kazzy, grabbed his arm, pulled him back step by step, never turning his back. Rengo didn't follow. He stayed behind, tail low, eyes steady, as if telling them both go. I've got this. Back at the clinic, Kazzy didn't resist as Elias cleaned the dirt from his hands and face. He didn't sign, he didn't tap, just sat, silent, staring at the rain outside. Elias couldn't sleep. He reviewed the footage again and again. The younger lion hadn't come to play. It had come for dominance, territory. Rengo was caught between two worlds, his bond to the sanctuary, and the call of the wild pride he no longer belonged to. The next morning, a ranger found something odd by the eastern fence. A single paw print, not Rengo's, larger, deeper, fresh. And beside it, two indentations in the mud. Finger marks, two taps. Elias stood there a long time, staring at those marks. He didn't know what they meant. A warning, a message, a goodbye. The staff began patrolling more regularly. They feared the younger lion might return, this time without Rengo to hold him back. And yet, nothing happened, until the night Kazzy disappeared again. This time, he disabled his tracker. No beeps, no alerts, just gone. Elias tore through the sanctuary, searching every corner. The rangers joined in. No trace, not a footprint, not a sound. At dawn, a soft roar echoed from the eastern ridge. Then silence, and then Kazzy returned, covered in scratches, limping, but alive. He collapsed at the edge of the clinic, chest heaving. Elias ran to him, cradled his head. Kazzy opened his eyes, blinked slowly, and with a trembling hand, tapped twice on Elias's chest. Elias didn't speak. He couldn't. Later that day, when Kazzy was resting, Elias reviewed the outer cameras. At 3:11 a.m., a figure appeared, Kazzy, moving toward the forest's edge. Then a second figure, Rengo. They stood face to face for 20 seconds. Kazzy reached out. The lion leaned down. No movement, no violence, just presence. A third figure entered the frame, the younger lion. It approached fast, aggressive. Kazzy stepped between them. And what happened next stunned Elias. Rengo didn't fight. He turned away. Led the younger lion back into the forest. A choice, a sacrifice. Kazzy came back alone. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sanctuary in amber, Elias sat with Kazzy under the old baobab. The primate leaned his head against Elias's shoulder, breath shallow. The scratches were healing. But something deeper had changed. He was no longer just the quiet observer. He was the guardian now, the bearer of memory. Elias finally whispered, "You brought him back once. Maybe that's enough." Kazzy didn't respond, but he didn't need to. At the edge of the forest, just as the last light vanished, a roar rang out. Not angry, not afraid, just there. And two slow taps echoed back from the earth. In the weeks that followed the second encounter at the ridge, something had shifted across the sanctuary. Not in the routines, not in the way food was prepared or fences checked, but in the weight of the air itself. It was quieter, as though the jungle held its breath. Every breeze through the trees carried whispers. Every rustle in the underbrush stirred tension instead of comfort. Elias walked the perimeter every morning before sunrise, not because he had to, but because his instincts demanded it. And every time his boots met the packed red soil, his eyes scanned the tree line for one thing, not for Rengo, not for the young rogue lion, but for Kazzy. Since the night Kazzy returned, scratched and silent, he had resumed his daily rituals, yet they were never quite the same. He no longer lingered at the fence facing the forest. He no longer tapped rhythms into the wooden beams of his perch. He had turned inward, as if he were waiting for something none of them could see. One morning, Elias entered the enclosure carrying fresh fruit and found Kazzy crouched low, staring at a patch of dirt he had carefully cleared. In the center were 5 deep lines etched with precision, 3 short, 2 long. Elias recognized them. They weren't random. They mirrored the old identification symbols used to mark specific lion territories in the wild. Kazzy was trying to say something. Elias crouched beside him, heart thudding. "Is this him?" he asked softly. Kazzy didn't sign yes or no. Instead, he dragged his finger through the last long line and tapped twice. The meaning hung in the air, unspeakable but clear. Something had happened in the forest. Rengo was still alive, but no longer alone, and perhaps no longer safe. That same afternoon, the power in the eastern sector of the sanctuary flickered and died. At first, the team assumed it was just the solar grid failing under cloudy skies. But when Elias checked the junction box behind the generator, he found the cables chewed, not torn by weather, but sliced with purpose. They weren't frayed, they were severed. At the same time, two motion detectors from the camera traps went offline. Zone 9 and Zone 11, the blind spots closest to the forest line. Something or someone was breaching. Rangers swept the zones, weapons ready but hearts uneasy. What they found wasn't an intruder. It was a series of tracks. Lion tracks, fresh, but not Rengo's. These were wider, deeper, and they weren't alone. Alongside them were human boot prints, 5 distinct pairs. Elias knelt down, pressing his hand into one of the prints. Cold, deep, recently made. He looked up at the trees, then toward the canopy trails. The poachers hadn't disappeared. They had circled back. Not for trophies, not for random prey, for revenge. When Elias returned to the clinic that night, Kazzy was already waiting for him. He sat upright, his back to the glass door, eyes locked on the blackness beyond the windows. When Elias entered, Kazzy turned slowly and signed something Elias hadn't seen in years. Fire come. It wasn't literal. Kazzy used the sign for fire the same way he had as a younger ape danger. Change. Destruction. It had always meant the world was about to shift. Elias crouched before him and whispered, "Then we stay ready." They doubled the perimeter guards that night, set flares on standby, pulled out the dart guns, just in case. But the true war, Elias knew, wouldn't be fought with weapons. It would come from the silence, the shadows, the very forest that had once been home and was now the front line. 3 nights later, it came. A single flare burst into the sky above Zone 11, and seconds later the siren tripped a low. Angry blare that Elias hadn't heard in months. The Rangers moved fast, but not fast enough. By the time they reached the eastern edge, 2 of the solar grid towers had already been destroyed. One Ranger was missing, blood on the leaves, but no sign of a body. Kazzy, somehow, had escaped his enclosure again. Elias didn't even question how. He found him already near the ridge, moving low to the ground. Eyes locked forward, and behind him, emerging from the forest like a shadow stretched long, was Rengo, bruised, thinner, limping slightly, but eyes blazing. Rengo moved straight to Elias, bumping his head gently against the vet's arm, then turned and roared toward the trees. Not a warning, a challenge. Elias felt it before he heard it. The crack of a branch, the shift in the leaves, then the unmistakable sound of rifles clicking into place. 5 silhouettes moved out of the undergrowth, faces covered, guns raised. One of them pointed at Kazzy, another raised a tranquilizer rifle at Rengo. And just as the first shot rang out, Kazzy moved. Not away, forward, between Elias and the poachers. The tranquilizer dart hit the dirt. And Rengo, he didn't wait. He lunged. Not at the humans, but at the one man reaching for the satchel, a satchel that, Elias realized too late, contained more than just tranquilizers. It held a remote, detonator, a fallback plan. The explosion was small, but targeted. It sent shrapnel into the base of the surveillance tower. Kazzy was thrown sideways. Rengo roared again, louder this time, not from fury, but from pain. Blood painted his chest. The poachers fled. Not all of them made it. The Rangers closed in, but none of that mattered to Elias, who ran to where Kazzy lay breathing. But barely, one arm dislocated, a gash along his ribs. And Rengo, who stood above him, nudging him gently with his muzzle, signing the only thing he knew how to with his body stay. "Stay here. Stay alive," Elias whispered. "Kazzy, come on, buddy." Kazzy opened one eye, weak, and slowly tapped the ground once. Then again. Rengo mirrored it, 1, 2, the same code, the same oath. They had kept it, together. The night faded into dawn, and with it came the end of the fight. The surviving poachers were taken into custody. Authorities flooded in. Questions rose. How did the sanctuary fail again? How did Kazzy get out? But none of it mattered to Elias. What mattered was that both Kazzy and Rengo were alive, scarred, changed, but breathing. That evening, Kazzy sat on the same perch he once abandoned, bandages tight against his side, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. Rengo lay in the tall grass nearby, tail flicking slowly. Neither looked at the other. They didn't have to. Two taps echoed from Kazzy's perch. One low rumble answered from the grass. The rains returned in early August, sweeping over the sanctuary in curtains of gray, making the thatched roofs leak and the radio signal crackle. But it was not the weather that soaked Elias in unease. It was the quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like a held breath before a scream. Since the attack, the sanctuary had fallen into a fragile rhythm. Security was tripled. Rengo's movements were tracked with a soft tag woven into his new collar. Not invasive, just enough to know he was near. Kazzy, still recovering from his injuries, remained unusually still most days, not from pain, but from thought. He stared into the canopy for hours, refusing fruit, refusing chatter, only signing two words over and over to Elias when asked what was on his mind. Deep trees, no one could tell if it was a place, a warning, or a memory. Elias began noticing strange things, birds abandoning certain branches, monkeys chattering then falling dead silent as if some invisible presence moved through their domain. At night, the camera feeds would freeze at exactly 2:13 a.m., then return minutes later with distorted frames, blurred images, shapes that didn't fit the known ecosystem. Rangers joked it was just humidity, but Elias didn't laugh. Neither did Kazzy. Then came the scratching. It started one night at the base of the observation tower, a low, rhythmic scraping like claws against stone. Elias rushed out with a flashlight, expecting to find a civet or stray canine. But there was nothing, just four shallow grooves in the wood, evenly spaced, identical to the mark Kazzy had once carved in the dirt. 4 lines, but no fifth, an incomplete message. The next morning, Rengo didn't come for food. His signal was still active, pulsing faintly from the far side of the reserve, close to a ravine known as Maw Valley. It was a dangerous area, off limits to visitors and even rangers due to unstable cliffs and deep sinkholes. Elias hesitated, then packed supplies. Kazzy met him at the gate, already waiting, eyes unreadable. Elias knew better than to argue. Together, they walked through the thicket, past branches heavy with moisture, through mud that sucked at their boots and paws. By the time they reached the edge of the valley, the sky had darkened not from storm, but from some looming dread that pressed against their skin. There, just beyond the ridge, was Rengo. He stood rigid, back arched, tail low, facing something hidden behind a cluster of fallen trees. His mane was matted with what looked like ash. Elias called softly. Rengo didn't move, not even an ear twitch. Then, slowly, Elias stepped closer, Kazzy at his side. They rounded the ridge, and they saw it. A lion. No, something that used to be a lion. Its body was scarred with burns, skin patchy, eyes clouded with a milky haze. Around its neck was a crude leather strap embedded with rusted tags numbers. Not names, it growled, low and broken, a sound more machine than beast. Rengo didn't growl back. He stepped forward, paused, then tapped the ground twice. The creature blinked, no response, just a snarl, teeth bared. Then another figure emerged, this one human. Elias raised his arm instinctively, shielding Kazzy, but the man didn't approach. He stood behind the broken lion, hand on a leash fashioned from scrap wire. Beautiful, aren't they? The man said, voice gravelly with accent. This one was from Uganda. Caught him 2 years ago, rewired his instincts. Now he only moves when told. Elias's stomach churned. This wasn't just poaching. This was experimentation. Weaponization. The man smiled. You thought you'd stopped us, but Rengo, he was just the beginning. Kazzy snarled, low and sharp. Rengo remained frozen. Then the broken lion lunged, not at them but toward Rengo. The leash went taut. The man shouted in a tongue Elias didn't know. The lion stopped midair, mid-motion, muscles twitching like puppet strings. Rengo didn't flinch. He just let out a long, low moan, a sound Elias had never heard before, a sound of pleading, of recognition. Elias realized something. This wasn't a new lion. This was Rengo's brother, the cub that went missing from the rescue group years ago, lost during a relocation mishap, presumed dead, now standing, barely alive, as a shell of what he once was. Elias moved forward, but Kazzy held him back, arm across his chest. The man chuckled. So you know, yes. Blood recognizes blood, but memory that we erase. Then he raised a remote. Elias reacted too late, but Kazzy didn't. He leapt, not at the man, at the lion. In a blur of movement, Kazzy landed between Rengo and his brother, slamming the broken lion to the side not to harm, but to push him away from the trigger. The device sparked, misfired. The man cursed. Rengo lunged, not at his brother, at the man. In seconds, it was over. The man lay groaning on the ground, arm bent unnaturally. Rengo stood above him, bleeding from the shoulder. The broken lion collapsed, shaking, but alive. Kazzy knelt beside him, signing something Elias didn't catch. Something with his hands, slow and deliberate. The lion looked back, and for a moment, it didn't snarl. It blinked, a flicker, a trace of something remembered. Later that night, Elias and the Rangers restrained the man and recovered fragments of his equipment footage. Documents, devices that proved a hidden operation to train wild predators as control units. Kazzy remained silent. Rengo limped behind him as they returned to the sanctuary. But something had changed that night. Kazzy refused the sleeping perch. He instead climbed the watchtower and sat facing the forest, eyes wide open, as if waiting. And Rengo lay beside the gate, his body curled protectively around his brother, who still twitched in fever dreams. No one slept. Not really. And above them, the moon watched in silence. The days after the encounter at Maw Valley passed like breaths held too long tight in the chest, quiet on the outside, but trembling underneath. Elias submitted his report, but there was no fanfare, no newspaper headlines, only silence from the authorities. It was clear someone wanted this buried. The man they captured, whose name turned out to be Silas Drone, had once worked for an unregulated private wildlife contractor. Now dissolved, now denied. The documents found on his body mentioned more than just predator control. They referenced biological obedience and emotional mapping. Elias couldn't sleep. Neither could Kazzy. The chimpanzee had changed subtly but deeply. He no longer participated in enrichment routines, no longer mimicked rangers for fun. He spent his days seated by the infirmary, where Rengo's brother, now named Kainu, lay sedated and recovering. Kainu didn't speak, didn't growl, didn't eat unless coaxed. But whenever Kazzy placed a hand on his fur, the lion would stop trembling. Sometimes, in the stillest moments, he tapped the ground. Not clearly, not like before, but a ghost of memory, perhaps. Meanwhile, Rengo had retreated into the deeper forest, not from fear, but from duty. Each morning, his paw prints marked the trail near the ridge, as if patrolling the boundary between sanctuary and shadow. Kazzy would greet him at dawn, tap once on the ground. Rengo never replied out loud, but once, just once, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently to Kazzy's chest. Elias watched from a distance, heart heavy with a love he didn't know how to hold. Then came the message, a simple brown envelope, unmarked, left on the outer gate. Inside was a photograph, an aerial shot of the sanctuary's layout with red circles over key points: the infirmary, the observation tower, the power shed. No note, no signature, just a ticking reminder that the storm wasn't over. Elias ordered a lockdown. They doubled night shifts. Kazzy refused to stay indoors. He climbed to the tallest perch of the compound and sat there, unmoving, watching the forest like a silent sentinel. The next attack came during twilight, when the fog was thick and the radio signal weak. Two men cut power to the northern fence line, slipped in through the underbrush, and headed straight for the infirmary. But they didn't count on Kazzy being awake, or Elias hearing the alarm before the power died completely. The first man never made it past the gate, He triggered a handmade tripwire Kazzy had strung from old vines and fishing line. The second reached the infirmary door. He raised his weapon and was met with a low, familiar growl. Not Rengo, not Kainu, Kazzy, standing upright, fists clenched, teeth bared, no roar, no scream, just a presence so heavy the man froze. That moment was enough. Elias tackled him from behind. The intruder dropped the weapon, and Kazzy struck the ground twice so hard the dust lifted like mist. The second man fled, disappearing into the dark, but he dropped a radio. Elias grabbed it, scanning frequencies, one phrase repeated across multiple channels. Fail, regroup, phase 2 begins. There were more of them, somewhere. Elias had no time. He gathered the remaining rangers, activated the emergency beacon. But help, if it came, would be late. That night, the forest didn't sleep. Every creature seemed to know. The hyenas didn't cackle, the birds didn't stir, and deep within the trees, eyes watched. Kazzy refused food, refused rest. He visited Kainu once, placing a hand gently on the lion's ribs, then looked to Elias and signed one word promise. Elias nodded, not because he understood, but because it felt like the only thing he could offer. At 3:17 a.m., the sanctuary's motion detectors lit up. 10 figures, armed, coordinated. Elias rallied the rangers. Rengo returned, wounds fresh but spirit unbroken. He took position beside the infirmary gate. And then, silence. For 10 whole minutes, the intruders did not approach. It was almost as if they were waiting for something. Then it came a loud, unnatural sound like metal grinding through stone. A signal. They advanced. The firefight was short. Smoke bombs, tranquilizer darts, chaos. One ranger fell. Another was wounded. Elias fired a flare to signal for backup. But amid it all, Kazzy was gone. Disappeared. Elias panicked. Until he heard the scream. Not of pain, but of defiance. He turned to the observation tower. Kazzy stood at the edge of the highest platform, holding something in his hand. It was the radio dropped earlier. He smashed it against the wood, then held up 2 fingers. Then, slowly, deliberately, he slammed his palm twice against the tower floor. A deep roar erupted from the tree line. Rengo and Kainu. They charged, not blindly but with purpose, not to kill, but to shield. Rengo took down the man closest to the infirmary. Kainu, though weak, rammed the power shed, cutting off enemy comms. In the confusion, Kazzy leapt, not to safety but into the heart of the attackers. He moved like a shadow. Elias tried to follow, but smoke burned his eyes. When the dust cleared, 4 men lay unconscious. The rest had fled. Kazzy sat alone in the clearing, chest rising and falling slowly. He was bleeding from a wound on his side, but smiling. And next to him lay the final radio, still blinking. Elias picked it up. A final transmission buzzed through Project Echo. Terminated. The sun rose minutes later. Backup arrived too late. But they found no intruders, no proof. Just a sanctuary standing. Barely. That evening, Elias stood beside Kazzy's resting perch. "You kept your promise," he whispered. Kazzy didn't respond. He just reached out, placed his hand on Elias's chest, then tapped the ground twice. Behind them, Rengo nuzzled Kainu, who for the first time let out a soft purr. The sanctuary would rebuild. The files would be stored. The names kept secret, but the story would live. In whispers, in shadows, in 2 taps of the earth. They were more than rescue animals. More than protected species. They were guardians of a truth too strange for headlines, too sacred for translation. And somewhere, deep in the forest, when the moon sits low and the trees don't rustle, you might hear it, a soft tap, then a low rumble. Kazzy and Rengo, still keeping watch,